Maine is my second home. In fact, this is my third visit to Maine since January 1st. A lot of people only come in the summer, but my wife and I have a place on the coast, another 3 hours away from Boston, which is, I won't say if it's prettier than Camden or not, because every fishing village in Maine is pretty, but it's a pleasure to be back in the state. Now, my talk at this conference, my task is to look at the problem of governance. Who's in control? Who makes the rules? Who's in charge? Which institutions have the greatest influence over actual outcomes in the food and farming system, over actual production outcomes and actual food consumption outcomes? And I can tell you right away, it isn't the poor, hungry people who need the greatest help. They don't have the political voice that they need. If they did, things would be much better than they are. If you go to South Asia, where the hungriest people are rural, landless laborers, they are politically marginalized. They don't have a voice. If you go to Africa, where the hungriest people are poor farmers in the countryside, they don't have a means to be effective politically. The average African farmer is a woman who is still illiterate, doesn't read or write in any language, is politically cut off from the government and from other farmers. The typical rural resident in Africa lives 2 kilometers from the nearest paved road. That's a 30-minute walk. Most household transportation in Africa takes the form of carrying things. You don't have access to governments or markets. You're essentially powerless politically. So who exercises influence? Is it multinational corporations? Is it international non-governmental organizations? Is it formal intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations? To tip you off in advance to my answer, I'm going to say it's none of the above. It's not poor farmers. It's not multinational corporations. It's not intergovernmental organizations. It's not international non-governmental organizations. It's still the separate national governments of sovereign states. They continue to play the dominant role. Now, this is a conclusion that I explain in my book, Food Politics. The second edition was just published last fall. My editor told me in this book they didn't want me to advocate anything. They wanted me simply to describe the political landscape. Where does power lie? And my conclusion that national governments remain dominant it's not a conclusion that I'm particularly pleased with. This is not an ideal situation for food security. It's certainly not an ideal situation if you happen to be a citizen of North Korea or Zimbabwe or today Syria. But it's a reality that we can't wish away. Many forward-looking, idealistic people have been hoping to be able to lift power out of the hands of governments and bring it up to a global level. For some people, that's a nightmare, but for many progressive, idealistic people, that's been the objective. But in the area of food and farming, at least, the project of building global governance has not gone very far. Change may be possible in the future, but the best way to promote that change is to at least have an accurate vision of where we stand today. So today, where does power lie? Thinking in the abstract, and that's sometimes a good idea, at least up to a point. It can be viewed as a contest between the international level institutions and national level institutions. At the international level, we have the periodic meetings of heads of government in the G8 and the G20 fora. We have intergovernmental organizations, formal intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization. We have multinational corporations like Cargill or ADM or Monsanto. We also have international non-governmental organizations. Some of them are foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Some are advocacy organizations like Greenpeace. At the national level, of course, we have national governments that have exclusive sovereign jurisdiction over what goes on within their national boundaries. So the question is, to what extent have these international level institutions been able to take some of that sovereign control away from national governments? To what extent are the national governments still in control? And let's start by looking at the periodic heads of government meetings that now take place in the G8 and the G20 settings. This is a picture of the 2012 G8 meeting at Camp David. The G8 meets in a different country every year. In 2012, the United States was the host country, so the meeting was at Camp David. You can see from this picture that President Obama is apparently making a forceful point to Prime Minister David Cameron, who seems a little defensive about whatever it was. Angela Merkel over there on the right seems to have tired of the discussion, or at least maybe her chair isn't comfortable enough. In any case, these are prominent meetings of the heads of the governments of the most prosperous and the most powerful countries on the planet. And at this particular meeting, food security was on the agenda, but nothing of any particular consequence emerged from this meeting. President Obama would have wished at this meeting to elicit from the other heads of government a mutual pledge that they would all increase, or at least maintain, their assistance to agricultural development projects in Africa. But he couldn't push that agenda because he couldn't make the pledge himself. The President of the United States doesn't appropriate funding for foreign assistance. That's what the Congress does. And the United States Congress had not delegated that authority to President Obama, so he couldn't put any money on the table himself. As for the European heads of government, this was 2012, they were still deep in an economic crisis. Their foreign assistance budgets were shrinking rather than growing, so they couldn't put any money on the table either. So what emerged from this meeting was a pledge, not by national governments to do something, but a hastily choreographed pledge by private companies to invest more in agricultural development in Africa. An impossible pledge to monitor and to enforce, and not a particularly appropriate one in Africa anywhere, where the greatest investment needs are for public goods like roads and power and education and agricultural research, not for the kinds of investments that private companies are likely to make. When we turn to the G20, another heads of government forum, this is the 2011 G20 meeting in Cannes in France. The G20 is the G8 plus some additional emerging and transitional powers like China, India, Turkey, and Brazil. At this particular meeting, hosted by President Nicolas Sarkozy of France, once again, food security was on the agenda. In fact, President Sarkozy had hoped to use this G20 meeting to achieve 3 food security objectives. First, he wanted the heads of government to agree on improved regulation of commodities futures markets. They'd been financialized, speculators were playing too large a role. He wanted new regulations to be set in place, but he was blocked. He got absolutely nowhere. The United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia, he must have seen them as an Anglo-Saxon axis of evil of some kind, said absolutely no to any new regulations on international financial activities. His second objective was to secure a reduction in subsidies and supports to biofuels production. There he was blocked by the United States and by Brazil. His third goal was to restrict the imposition of export bans in international grains markets. There he was blocked by Russia, which had imposed an export ban in 2010 in order to hold grain prices at home under control. So Sarkozy got nowhere here. Both in the G8 and in the G20, decisions are made by consensus. So any individual state can block an agreement. The national governments retain a veto power. And these heads of government meetings can sometimes facilitate cooperation among states, but they really pose no threat at all to the sovereign power of states. When we turn to more formal intergovernmental organizations, like, for example, the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, this is a photo from the 2012 joint meeting of these institutions. Christine Lagarde is at the left. She's the managing director of the IMF, and Jim Young Kim from the United States is on the right. He's the president of the World Bank. These two international financial institutions have often been accused of bullying national governments from the developing world into taking unwelcome positions in the food and farming sector through the conditions that are placed on loans that are made for financial stabilization or for structural adjustment. And there's some truth to this, yet when this bullying takes place, it's not these institutions that are doing the bullying. It's the major economic powers that provide resources to these institutions that are doing the bullying. These institutions are the agents. It's the major economic powers, the United States, the European powers in particular, that are the principals. This is why the managing director of the IMF is always a European. Christine Lagarde is from France. This is why the president of the World Bank is always an American. Jim Young Kim is from the United States. And sometimes when these organizations try to bully smaller powers, they're unsuccessful. National governments can stand up to these organizations. In one World Bank study, of 29 governments in sub-Saharan Africa that underwent structural adjustment lending with conditions imposed, it was discovered that of those 29 countries, in the end, only 4 had liberalized their agricultural markets according to the requirements that the World Bank had expected. And none of the 29 had both liberalized their agricultural markets and set in place the macroeconomic policies that these financial institutions had demanded. So these financial institutions can do their best to try to rent policy change, but they can't really buy policy change from sovereign national governments. Another intergovernmental organization that I think has powers that have been exaggerated in the area of food and farming is the World Trade Organization in Geneva. As an organization, the World Trade Organization, as a very small secretariat, it does not make the rules governing trade in food and farming. WTO is really nothing more than a meeting place where separate national governments attempt to negotiate new agreements among themselves. It's an organization that operates by consensus, once again, so any significant government that doesn't want to enter into a new multilateral agreement on trade can block the entire process, which is what happened in the Doha round that was launched in 2001 and adjourned without agreement in 2008, and it hasn't been revived. And when this happens, because national governments can't agree, there's nothing that the WTO Secretariat can do about it. Now, it's true that the WTO has a dispute settlement body that is supposed to be empowered to enforce the agreements that have been reached through international negotiations, but even that body is limited in what it can do if it's up against a determined national government. One example is the case of the United States. In 2005, the United States government was found by the dispute settlement body to have violated its obligations under the 1993 Agreement on Agriculture. Its cotton subsidy program was in violation of that agreement. That was 2005. The U.S. didn't change its program. In fact, 3 years later, in 2008, Congress enacted a new farm bill that renewed some of the offending provisions that the WTO had labeled as illegal. This is an organization that has limited teeth when it comes to enforcing even the agreements that national governments have voluntarily entered into. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, if we turn to IGOs within the UN system, here I think we find more evidence that national governments have not yielded any of their sovereign authority to intergovernmental organizations in the food and farming sector. This is a typical scene at an FAO World Food Summit. Here, delegates from separate national governments spend hours listening to other delegates from national governments read prepared speeches. This is not a setting in which political bargains are struck and actions are agreed to be taken. The output of these summits is usually a bland resolution that is, it's unfunded and it's non-binding. And in the case of the 2009 summit, this unfunded, non-binding resolution had actually been negotiated before the summit took place by lower-level officials, and the approval of the resolution was the first act taken at the summit. This is not the way serious politics takes place. Now, the reason the FAO doesn't have more authority than this is that this organization doesn't work by consensus. It's a one-country, one-vote system. That's the way most of the UN operates. And so the major economic powers in Europe and the United States don't want to give the FAO any authority because there are too many small African governments who could use their one-country, one-vote rule to gain excessive influence. So the FAO isn't given resources. It relies on member country dues for its resources. Member countries don't pay it enough. Sometimes the US doesn't pay its dues at all. This is an organization that you can't count on to govern global food and farming systems. Some UN organizations are highly effective, but once again, with limitations when it comes to governance and to political power. This is another Rome-based UN organization, the World Food Program, which manages the delivery of food assistance to poor countries that are facing famine threats and to refugee populations. This organization has a proven record for preventing famine, as it did in Eastern and Southern Africa twice, in the early 1990s and again in 2001, 2002, and in Pakistan in 2010 after devastating floods there. It's a wonderful organization, but it doesn't have its own resources. It gets its financial resources and its donated food resources from national governments in the industrial world. And it has to beg those governments for those resources. And in the countries where it works, if it doesn't have cooperation from the local national government, it can't work, and the results are sometimes tragic. National governments who don't want to work with the WFP can keep them out. WFP was blocked from the free delivery of food assistance in North Korea after food problems escalated there in the mid-1990s, and the result was a terrible famine in 1997 where more than 1 million North Koreans starved to death. The World Food Program in 2011 managed to prevent a famine in the Horn of Africa, worst drought in the Horn in 60 years, everywhere except southern Somalia, where a jihadist militia group decided they didn't want the WFP to come in. WFP doesn't have guns and ships and planes to push that militia aside and get food to hungry people, so once again, there was a famine. And in Syria today, the government in Damascus is blocking the WFP from delivering relief to about 250,000 civilians in opposition-controlled territory. And a serious food crisis is underway. Britain's Foreign Secretary has called this a deliberate starvation of civilians by the Syrian government. There's nothing the WFP can do about this. Now, there's another international institution. It's actually a network of institutions, the CGIR, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, a network of research centers chaired by the World Bank that has a record of success in developing technologies that can help farmers in developing countries. Yesterday we heard a nice talk from Ann Tutwiler, who's the Director General of one of these centers, Bioversity International in Rome. But when it comes to extending useful technologies to farmers in the developing world, there are limits to what these international research centers can accomplish. In order to get technology into the hands of farmers, you need competent partners at the local level. In agricultural research, all the problems you have to solve tend to be site-specific and local. They can't be solved without constant interactive relations with local farming communities. Technologies can't be extended without a national extension service. They can't be continuously improved without a functioning national agricultural research system. So where these institutions don't exist at the national level, the international centers find it extremely difficult to deliver benefits. And unfortunately, in Africa today, these national level institutions have been underfunded, underdeveloped, and they have weak capabilities. In Africa today, national governments have unfortunately spent much too little on agriculture. 60% of their citizens are farmers or graze animals, and yet they'll typically devote only 5% of their public budget to any kind of agricultural development. And very little of that, almost none of that, goes to research. At latest count in Africa, only half of governments for which data was available had even met their own modest targets on investments in agricultural research and development. So when national governments don't deliver the goods, these international centers have limits to what they can deliver. So if intergovernmental organizations are not powerful enough to challenge national governments, what about multinational corporations? There are a lot of multinational companies that have global reach in the food and farming sector, in trade, Cargill, in processing, in biofuels, ADM, in retail, Walmart, in food service, McDonald's. And arguments are often made that companies like these can control outcomes by monopolizing markets or by influencing governments, either with bribes or with campaign contributions or with whatever. But I don't find these arguments particularly persuasive. I find national governments are still, for the most part, in control. If you look at food retail. Walmart, for a decade, has been trying to get multi-brand stores into India. They can't. The government of India is under the influence of small local mom and pop stores that don't want to compete with the multinational retailer. So the government of India told Walmart, well, we'll let you in, but only if you promise to source 30% of what you sell from within India, which is a regulation that no other retailer in India has to observe. So Walmart backed off and walked away. So Walmart wanted to get in, but the national government didn't want them there, so they didn't get in. When it comes to controlling international grain trade, sometimes you hear that the big grain trading companies, the ABCD companies, that's Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, Louis Dreyfus, you sometimes hear that they monopolize world food markets, but they operate in international trade, and only 10% of food supplies are ever traded internationally. So even if you controlled international trade, you wouldn't control food, and they don't really control international trade. They handle international trade from an export terminal to an import terminal, but they compete with each other, and they don't set the rules under which food crosses borders. If they did, there wouldn't be the high barriers to international trade that exist today. The trading companies were desperate for the Doha round to succeed so that national barriers to international trade would go down. The Doha round failed, so national barriers are still high. India, under the WTO, can, if it wants, impose more than a 100% tariff on imports of grain from abroad. A lot of governments in the developing world have national self-sufficiency policies that block the aspirations of these trading companies to expand commerce in agriculture. If these companies were really powerful, we'd be seeing very different outcomes in the WTO than we're seeing today. As for the power of companies that sell patented seeds, this issue came up yesterday, like the Monsanto company. Critics sometimes forget that patent law isn't set globally. It's set country by country. Each individual national government determines what kinds of intellectual property rights it's willing to recognize. And in only a handful of governments around the world today is it legal to register a patent on seeds. In almost all of the developing world, it isn't legal to register a patent on seeds. So a patent that Monsanto might have on a seed trait in the United States or in Canada is legally meaningless in China or India or Africa. Patent law is under the, I don't care what you think about patent law, my point is it's under the control of national governments, not under the control of some global governance system. And it's certainly not under the control of multinational corporations. Actually, national governments also exercise power over biotechnology companies like Monsanto through regulatory systems. Many people don't realize that in the developing world today, in only a few countries is it even legal for farmers to plant genetically engineered seeds. National governments have biosafety committees, national biosafety committees, that either approve or disapprove research on or the commercial planting of any genetically engineered seeds. And as of today, in Africa, only 3 countries, Sudan, Burkina Faso, and the Republic of South Africa, have yet made it legal for farmers to plant any genetically engineered seeds. So national governments have the regulatory upper hand. That's the point I want to make. However, they use that upper hand. And it goes beyond that, because even where national governments are willing to approve the commercialization of genetically engineered seeds, sometimes the companies voluntarily withdraw their products from the market because they've encountered informal consumer resistance in the marketplace. Monsanto has encountered this, interestingly enough, for its genetically engineered wheat, which isn't being planted commercially anywhere. It's been available for more than a decade. It's never been commercialized. Monsanto's genetically engineered rice, never been commercialized anywhere. Its genetically engineered potatoes were commercialized in the late 1990s, but then voluntarily withdrawn after consumer resistance emerged. So this allegedly powerful company that has spent hundreds of millions of dollars developing these technologies has actually lost every battle when it comes to genetically engineered food crops in particular. They've been successful with some industrial crops like cotton and some animal feed crops like corn and soybeans, but with food crops, they have suffered a devastating across-the-board defeat. Now, the defeat has in part come through the influence of international non-governmental organizations that have campaigned against GMOs and have turned consumers against the technology. And this raises the possibility that it's actually non-governmental organizations that hold power over food and farming around the world, including some like Greenpeace, which has been the leader in the international campaign against GMOs, or La Via Campesina, which has been a campaigner against the globalization of agricultural markets, or Oxfam, which has worked hard on famine relief and agricultural development assistance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has done the same thing. But here again, I would argue that national governments are still in control. They still have the upper hand. The resources available to these non-governmental organizations are minuscule compared to the resources available to national governments. And if a national government doesn't want these NGOs operating inside its borders, it can simply kick them out. National governments, NGOs inside a country are constantly looking over their shoulder to make sure that they haven't gone too far, or they won't be there at all. In food and agriculture, non-governmental organizations are extremely important. They do a marvelous job of delivering services and training. But even if national governments were to let them, they wouldn't have the resources to give poor countries what they most desperately need right now, which is large investments in rural roads, in rural power, in irrigation, in agricultural research, in rule of law, in property rights and land reform. These are things that have to be done in the public sector. These are things that national governments have to do. If national governments don't do them, they won't happen. So now finally on to national governments. We ought to ask, what is it in the so-called age of globalization that allows these antiquated institutions, national governments, to retain so much control in the food and farming sector? And it's actually, in a sense, it's an international factor. It's the rules of international law, which give national governments exclusive sovereign jurisdiction to determine what crosses their border and exclusive sovereign options to tax and regulate exclusive. Outsiders can't do it. They can, and only they can, tax and regulate what goes on inside their border. So if the US government decides to subsidize ethanol in a way that pushes up the international price of corn, nobody can stop us. If African governments decide to underinvest in agricultural development in a way that holds back the productivity of farming and keeps African farmers poor, there's nothing outsiders can do to block it or prevent it. It's easier for national governments to exercise this kind of exclusive control in the food and farming sector because the most important resources in this sector tend to be relatively immobile, particularly agricultural land, particularly agricultural water, and also, to a large extent, farmers themselves. These things tend to stay put within national borders, and they're easily controlled and captured by national governments. But now let me step back. What I find interesting is that in spite of this antiquated system of separate sovereign nation states being in control, substantial progress has been made in reducing the prevalence of chronic undernutrition in the developing world. You can see that in comparing 1990 to 2010, 2012, in Asia, the prevalence of hunger down from 24% to 14%. That's remarkable progress. That's the most populous part of the developing world. That represents hundreds of millions of people escaping hunger and poverty. In Latin America and the Caribbean, from 15% down to 8%, a wealthier region to begin with. They still had considerable hunger in 1990-92. Now it's only half at that level. And even in Africa, down from 28% to 23%, despite all of Africa's difficulties. And its extremely rapid population growth, your chances of being hungry in Africa today are significantly smaller than they were in 1990, 1992. What explains this success, despite the system of national government control that I've been somewhat critical of until now? Well, partly it reflects the fact that for regions such as Asia and Africa, allowing separate national governments to have the last word is at least better than the previous system, which was to let the colonial masters back in Europe have the last word. We can complain a lot about governance in Asia and Africa today, but I hope none of us would want to go back to the previous system. These promising results also partly reflect the fact that more of today's separate sovereign governments, particularly in Asia and Latin America, but also now in Africa, are chosen through competitive democratic elections. This increases the accountability of governments to their own societies, including even the rural poor. As democracy has spread, food security has improved. As Amartya Sen has reminded us, there's never been a famine in a democratic country. So the spread of democracy has led to the reduction of hunger and poverty. But let me close with one final concern. As the threat of undernutrition has slowly receded, in part because of better governance at the national level, a new threat has been growing, and that's this threat of overnutrition. These lines measure the percent of populations that are technically overweight with a body mass index above 25, projected out to 2020. These data are from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And you can see that while the United States is clearly the leader, and actually some other Anglo-Saxon countries are curiously right behind us, England, Canada, and Australia. It seems that liberty-loving Anglo-Protestant societies have a very difficult time regulating excessive consumption behavior. But many others are following in our path. And what I find interesting about this worrisome trend is that we haven't yet come up with an appropriate and achievable set of policy responses to slow or to reverse this crisis. But now I'm getting ahead of the problem a bit. Our next speaker, Gus Schumacher, has considerable experience working in this area, and so I'll let him handle this particular problem. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. It's great. I'm going to put you in the far chair so I can see the monitor. Thanks, Rob. Appreciate that. I need to apologize at the outset for not practicing what I preach and not reading the bios that are actually in the program that I've asked you to, or I would have caught the Wellesley reference. And having attended a few classes there and then married a Wellesley woman, I feel like I almost have a degree from Wellesley as well. Good. Before I open up to questions, just a quick one from me. I didn't see any reference to trade treaties and pacts, which are really a way that national governments sometimes give up some of their rights. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Well, I mentioned the Doha round, which was intended to be the next treaty, and it failed. It failed because China didn't want a new agreement on agriculture. They thought they'd made enough concessions to get into the WTO. The United States and the Europeans were making very modest offers, not enough to satisfy some developing countries like Brazil and India that wanted much greater access to markets in North America and in Europe. And so the Doha round is in suspension. It's not going anywhere. In a sense, this reflects the emergence of more significant economic powers. In the old days, you could reach an agreement in the WTO if the Americans and the Europeans and the Japanese all agreed. Now you've got to have the Brazilians and the Indians and the Chinese. And so as the number of major economic powers proliferates, what's achievable through the old consensus-based systems of global governance, as modest as it was then, is now even more modest today.
I believe mic 1, right over here.
Andrew Stanchov from Spruce Head, Maine, and I can't disagree with almost anything you said, but I'd like you to make two comments. One relates to controls. You mentioned colonialism, and it still exists in one area where about 140 million people in 14 countries in Francophone Africa are controlled by what is known as the CFA Franc Zone, where all the decisions are made in Paris. So and there are no central banks in those countries that can make their own decisions. Those countries, if France decides to devalue, those countries are screwed, if you'll excuse the expression. Yeah. The other comment is, yes, certainly national entities have great control, but in the case, for instance, and I'll only use one, of Allende's fall and Pinochet's accession to power, outside governments did help. And Allende happened to be a great proponent of agriculture. So I'd like you to comment on those 2 points.
Okay, well, in the second case, national governments were in control, and the national government with the more powerful instruments of influence prevailed. It wasn't a victory for global governance when the Allende regime was toppled, and it wasn't a victory for multinational corporations either. The United States government was worried about communism in Chile, not about someone nationalizing ITT. At least that's my interpretation of what was going on. In the first case, you're right. Probably the one part of the world where post-colonial influence is greatest is in French West Africa. I agree with that. But even in the Western Hemisphere, we see some post-colonial influence or some modern-day neo-colonial influence from the United States. A lot of countries in the Western Hemisphere have monetary schemes that are virtually dollarized or literally dollarized. And so major economic powers have enormous influence today. But my point is it's national governments that have influence. It's not the IMF that's doing it. It's the Fed, it's the Treasury, it's the United States Congress, it's the instruments of the national government of the United States.
We're going to go up to the balcony. Mic 3.
Yes, sir. My name is John Dvorak. I'm a student in policy and international affairs, and I've got actually 2 points. The first point was I actually took severe issue with your very final graph and closing points, or it was missing, some noteworthy points like Mexico or Bahrain, which are, neck and neck with the United States in terms of overnutrition. And so I was kind of wondering, including a more complete data set, does that adjust your final point? But then the other thing that I'm more curious about is you spent a lot of time talking about the limits, of these organizations, but do you have any actionable policy things going forward? What can we do, and what do you think are the solutions to these problems? You very eloquently laid out what the problems are, but where should we go from here?
Okay, good. Yeah, the trend lines in overweight and obesity, I just lifted that from an OECD publication. Bahrain's not an OECD country, so it wasn't on the list. Mexico is an OECD country, but it wasn't on the graph. But you're right, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, as of last summer, Mexico has now actually surpassed the United States in the prevalence of obesity specifically, which is BMI not above 25, but BMI above 30. And the reasons for that are still controversial. Some people say, well, Mexico's too close to the United States, and so they're swamped with too many U.S. foods sold through Walmart in Mexico. They drink too much Coca-Cola. Other people say, no, what's going on is rapid urbanization in Mexico, and so physical activity levels are way down, and it's almost certainly a combination of the two. As for what can be done going forward, I think you'd have to be very precise and very specific as to in what sector you'd like to focus. The sector that concerns me the most is making more public investments in the rural infrastructure, the research, and the educational resources available to poor farmers in rural Africa and in rural South Asia. And what can be done there, if you're an American citizen, is to put more pressure on your member of Congress to support adequate appropriations for development assistance spending. It's unfortunate that U.S. expenditures on agricultural development in Africa fell by 86% between 1985 and 2006. They've increased a little bit since then, but we are still doing only a fraction in Africa today of what we were doing in the 1980s, at a time when, in the 1980s, there were half as many Africans, and today there are twice as many, and we're doing only a fraction as much, and too little progress is being made. So I like to focus on what's available to us if you're a U.S. citizen, and that's your own national political system, and your representatives in Congress are a good place to start.
I'm going to go to mic 2 right here.
Hi, Andrew Guzman from UC Berkeley. So I have no disagreement with what you say, but it seems to me that if we were to, exactly as you said, if we were to pick one thing that the United States can do, a development system is a plus, but not nearly as big as liberalizing our own agricultural system. If the US, Europe, maybe Japan did it, the welfare gains to developing countries would be enormous. Something that I think maybe I just wanted to bring out at least at some point in this conference. The somewhat slightly less related point that I'm going to sneak in anyway has to do with your graphic on improved nutrition, I think it was, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I think we should not pass through that without noting that the real driving force, at least in Asia, has been a move in China and India from planned economies, or communist economies in China's example, to market-based economies. To some extent, that's true in Latin America as well. The economic gains in China and India have been fantastic, and the dominant reason is that they've moved to a market-based economy, something we shouldn't forget.
Okay, I think you're right about the move to market-based economy, explaining the timing of the gains in China after 1978 and the timing of the gains in India after 1991. But I find it interesting that in both of those countries, substantial public sector investments provided the foundation. In India during the Green Revolution, at one point in India in 1971, the government was spending 22% of its total public budget on agricultural research, agricultural infrastructure, agricultural education, agricultural extension. That's what gave India the foundation that it now has. In Africa today, they're spending 5%, and they want to catch up with India when India was spending 22%. And in China, of course, China's remarkable success came not just from the liberalizing Deng Xiaoping reforms after 1978, but also from massive investments in infrastructure and in education and in public health, and a land reform in the 1950s that went through a dark, deep period of misguided leadership under Mao Zedong, but eventually provided the basis for the household responsibility system that's been so successful recently. Regarding liberalization of agricultural subsidies, this is a tricky issue. I agree that U.S. Subsidies distort international markets, but if you break it down, who would win from liberalization? If the United States liberalized its wheat market completely, the big winners would probably be Canadians and Australians. If the United States liberalized its sugar markets, the big winners would be South Africa and Brazil. If the United States liberalized its corn and soybean markets, the big winners would be Argentina. It's pretty hard to find an African country. If you liberalized U.S. cotton policy, the big winner would probably be China. Africa would win too. But one thing that's holding cotton exports back in Africa is not the international trade regime. It's Africa's own inadequate investments in processing, in infrastructure, in the knowledge systems needed to compete in agricultural markets today. So I want that liberalization for the reasons that you described, but I don't think we should put all of our eggs in that basket because there are other things going on.
We're going to have to stop there, but Rob will be available during the break and will be part of our panel later today as well. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.